All right. So, sometimes you just get into those moods where you want to really think about the big questions.
Right.
Like
Absolutely.
maybe you've had one of those late night conversations that just sort of spirals into the nature of reality, or, you've stumbled across an ancient philosophy or religious text or something that just kind of blows your mind.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the headspace we're going for in this deep dive today.
Okay.
We're exploring the Outkast The Pattern Podcast.
It's pretty fascinating stuff. They go deep into some really interesting territory, like philosophies and religions and even...
Yeah, the occult and shamanism and all sorts of stuff.
Exactly. They're looking for the hidden connections, the underlying patterns that tie all these seemingly disparate things together.
Right. It's like they're saying, look beyond the surface. There's something more going on here.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to unpack in this deep dive. We're going to pull out some of their core ideas and really examine their perspective on these big questions.
Okay, so should we jump right in then?
Let's do it.
Okay, so one of the big things they keep coming back to is this idea of what they call the philosophy, right?
Right.
And they describe it as this ancient, pre-human wisdom truth, almost like a universal principle.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that they don't just present it as an idea or a concept,
Right.
They talk about it as this fundamental aspect of reality, something that's deeply woven into the fabric of our being.
Okay, so it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's something experiential.
Exactly. They talk about uncovering and understanding and embodying the deeper parts of the spirit to achieve a complete integration, a wholeness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what's the central point of this philosophy as they lay it out?
The core tenet, and this is really key, is that by achieving mastery over yourself, over your inner world,
Yeah.
you can then achieve mastery over your surroundings, over your outer world.
And they're very clear about this mastery coming without magic, without belief systems, without subjection.
Yes, that's a really crucial point because it suggests a form of power that's completely inherent. It doesn't rely on any external forces or dogmas or rituals.
It's like you have the power within you already.
Precisely, and they directly link this to the idea of master consciousness and the absolute importance of self-knowledge.
Right, the classic know thyself.
Exactly, but they take it a step further. They say it's not just a suggestion, it's literally the precipice of mastering one's own self-enlightenment.
So it's not about joining a group or following a set of rules or anything like that?
No, it's about this deep internal work, this process of self-discovery and self-mastery.
Oh, okay. And they also talk about overcoming some of the common human challenges like laziness or the tendency to rely on others to solve our problems.
Yeah, and they place a lot of emphasis on self-healing, the idea that true healing comes from within.
Right. So it's not a passive philosophy. It requires effort and action.
Absolutely. They call it a praxis, something
Yeah.
you actively engage with and practice in your daily life.
And it's not tied to any particular religion or belief system, right?
No, they're very clear about that. They say it's not about blind faith or following any external authority.
In fact, they go as far as to say that this philosophy is unownable, unmanipulable, and eternally enduring.
Yeah, it's this fundamental truth that exists independently of human interpretation.
And they even suggest that it might be an irritation to those who don't grasp it.
That's an interesting point. Why would it be an irritation?
Well, I think it's because this philosophy doesn't require any external validation. It challenges those who rely on established belief systems or power structures.
Right. It's it disrupts the status quo.
Exactly. They talk about those who forged the old floor plan, creating it with functions and laws to control life and rings of power to harness the people. It seems like they're suggesting there's this pre-existing system, maybe even an engineered reality, that operates according to specific rules and power dynamics.
And that the philosophy offers a way to understand and potentially transcend this system.
Right. They say understanding the philosophy is the key out of the system, but you need to understand the nature of the realm in which we exist first.
Okay, so that leads us to their discussion of reality itself.
Right. They start by talking about the energy fields that surround living beings, like auras or bubbles of protection.
Yeah, what they call electromagnetic field physics.
Right. But then they make this really interesting point. They say that the realm, while often perceived as a mirror, isn't actually a true duality system.
Okay, so they're rejecting this idea that everything exists as pairs of opposites, good and bad, light and dark,
Exactly.
Yeah.
They argue that this concept of duality is based on illusions and that the mirror analogy is misleading.
How so?
Because a mirror inherently implies inversion, a flipping of what's real.
Right.
And this idea of inversion can lead to what they call material worship, where we focus on the external reflection rather than the internal source.
Okay, so if they're rejecting duality, what do they propose instead?
They talk about the world being the created aspect and the creative force being another aspect, and that these two form a state of unison, balance, or harmony.
So it's not about opposition, it's about interconnectedness.
Right, and they talk about breaking down the illusion by breaking the mirrors, suggesting that by dismantling our belief in duality, we could perceive the underlying unity of reality.
But they also mention that we're still operating within the torus model.
Right, so understanding this model is crucial for navigating this perceived illusion of duality.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Now, this leads into their discussion of mirror magic and projection.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting.
They talk about dualists or system operators, elites, or members of hidden societies who supposedly use mirror magic.
So what exactly is mirror magic?
They describe it as a technique of projecting ideas or feelings into what they call the trapezoid as the void, using a mirror or an altar as a focal point.
So it's like a form of psychic influence.
Yeah, and they suggest that this technique is used to project specific feelings or ideas onto individuals, especially those who are materialistic or emotionally focused.
Making them more susceptible to manipulation.
Exactly.
Right.
And they believe that our belief in duality makes us vulnerable to these projections.
Because we mistake these external projections for our own authentic feelings or for objective reality.
Right, and they call duality a flawed ideology and illusion that makes us vulnerable to manipulation.
So it's not just a neutral observation, it's an active force that shapes our perceptions and experiences.
Exactly. Now, this ties into their discussion of the illusion of perception.
Okay, how so?
They argue that even what we see with our own eyes is already a form of illusion, and they use the flat earth versus round earth debate as an example.
That's an interesting example. What are they trying to illustrate with that?
They're not taking sides in the debate. They're using it to show how our focus on the material world can create these false dualities.
Right, because we get so caught up in our beliefs and interpretations.
Exactly, and they say that the mind is constantly trying to rationalize and make sense of sensory input, and this process can be heavily influenced by our pre-existing beliefs.
So we're not seeing the world objectively, we're seeing it through the lens of our own subjective filters.
Right, and this leads to these rigid dualistic perspectives.
Okay, so their argument is that this focus on the material world distracts us from the true non-dual nature of reality.
They state very clearly that the realm has always been non-dual.
And they contrast this limited dualistic way of seeing with the perspective of the original creative force, which perceives everything simultaneously and holistically.
They even suggest that we all have the potential for this kind of unified perception, but we've been conditioned to see things in a dualistic way.
And they use the symbol of the one eye on the prize, or the eye of Horus, to represent this limited perspective.
Right. They say that those who adhere to duality are only looking outward, missing the crucial internal dimension.
And they emphasize that even sight itself is a process that originates internally through the interpretation of sensory information.
So it's not just about what we see, it's about how we see.
And they argue that this framework of duality creates our understanding of good and bad as these opposing forces.
So if we can transcend duality, we can also transcend these rigid moral categories.
Right. And they present non-dualists or whole-minded beings as individuals who have cultivated the ability to perceive the world metaphysically and to rationalize without disrupting their internal balance.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about their concept of electromagnetic field physics.
All right.
They describe this as the energy field that exists within and around each individual and how it interacts with the physical world and other beings.
Right, like our auras.
Right. But they take it a step further. They suggest that those who operate within the dualistic system, what they call trapezoid worshippers, can intentionally influence an individual's electromagnetic field.
How do they do that?
They say they use mirrors as focal points and adopt a limited one-eye perspective.
And they connect this to the Roman god Janus, who represents duality and the manipulation of the present through controlling perceptions of the past.
Exactly. And they also talk about symbolic representations, what they call pictures or sigils, which can be used to influence these energy fields.
So these sigils can be like physical objects or even ideas or concepts.
Right. And they suggest that these sigils can be embedded in things like world news and current events,
creating underlying currents of fear or urgency or other emotions.
Exactly. And they also mention these more esoteric concepts like the zoo and the 12 planetary archons.
And the manipulation of religious texts and the construction of new belief systems.
Right. It's like they're suggesting there's this deliberate shaping of reality through various forms of symbolic manipulation and control over information.
Okay, so they're not saying that these system operators are necessarily deluded. They're saying they're consciously using these dualistic frameworks as tools for influence.
Precisely. And they go on to say that actually believing that the mere reflection is the true reality is a form of psychosis.
Where we project our internal states onto the external world and mistake them for objective truth.
And they also talk about the darkening as a necessary process to burn away old beliefs and idols.
So it's like a period of deconstruction where we shed our illusions and confront reality in its raw form.
Right. And they reject the idea of equivalent exchange as another manifestation of the dualistic framework.
Okay, now let's talk about their perspective on the pentagram and the elements.
Yeah, they have a pretty unique take on that.
They critique the traditional pentagram, saying it's based on a flawed ideology with an inaccurate number of elements.
They propose that there are actually 18 elements within the 19th, which they call ether.
And these 18 elements form a circle, which represents the spirit.
And they say that the traditional fifth element, the circle around the 4 points, is something that already exists within us.
Right. We already possess these 18 elements in our physical bodies, which they describe as clothes for the spirit.
And finally, they touch on the torus model, which they've mentioned several times.
What's their interpretation of that?
They say it's not an external cosmic structure, but a symbolic representation of a complete and perfect system that resides within our souls.
So again, it all comes back to the internal.
Exactly. And they end by inviting their audience to engage further with their podcasts.
Which makes sense. They want to encourage people to explore these ideas and have these conversations.
So to sum it all up, we've explored some of the core ideas presented by the Outkast The Pattern Podcast.
Their concept of the philosophy, their critique of duality and mirror magic, their insights into perception, their understanding of the electromagnetic field, and their alternative interpretations of symbols like the pentagram.
And it all comes back to this central theme of the internal.
Right, they're saying that the key to understanding reality and achieving mastery lies within us, not in external systems or beliefs.
It's a pretty radical perspective.
It is. It definitely gives us a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it raises some really interesting questions about the nature of reality and how we experience it.
Right, like if our perception is filtered through belief systems and potentially manipulated through things like mirror magic, what does that mean for our understanding of ourselves and the world?
It's a deep question.
It is, and it leads to another question. What steps can we take to move towards a more genuine and authentic understanding of ourselves and the world around us?
It's a journey worth exploring.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process of self-discovery and exploration.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there for today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it insightful.
And we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas.
And see where they lead you.
Take care.
See you next time.